Well, I'm very pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to speak to you on what is, well, it's a very historic day, so it's a year after the EU referendum, and a very historic week because it was this week when we saw the launch of the negotiations. So on Monday, we had David Davis sitting down with Michel Barnier in the European Commission to start the negotiations for the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. Now, what I want to do in the presentation today is really shine a light on that negotiation process and highlight a couple of issues that I think so far haven't really commanded the attention that they deserve. And I'd really like us to have these thoughts kind of higher up in our minds as we go through the coming months and the coming years. So, first things first, let us be crystal clear that there are two sets of negotiations that we're talking about. Firstly, the Article 50 negotiations, and this concerns the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. So moving from an EU of 28 to an EU of 27. So these are predominantly very technical issues, however, they are highly political. And there is a 2-year window for the agreement of these Article 50 negotiations. Launched on March the 29th, 2017, with Theresa May's Article 50 letter. So they have to be concluded by, well, the UK will be leaving the European Union at midnight on the 30th of March 2019. Now, in order to ensure there's sufficient time for the ratification of this agreement, the negotiations themselves need to be wrapped up by October 2018. So this is the timescale we're talking about with respect to those Article 50 negotiations. Now, there is a separate set of negotiations concerning the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. And amongst many, the hope is that this will take the form of a free trade agreement, or indeed a comprehensive free trade agreement. So let us be really clear in our minds that we've got these two separate negotiations to consider. Now, we are going to focus, in the first instance today, on the Article 50 negotiations themselves. So let's quickly blast through the main EU actors. So who have we got on the European scene? The European Commission. And this is where the day-to-day of the negotiations will be taking place. They have the capacity and the expertise to negotiate under the leadership of Michel Barnier. And there's a picture of him up on the screens. And this is a face that we will all become increasingly familiar with over the coming months and years. Then we have the European Council. Now, the European Council in this context is the meeting of the heads of state and government of the EU 27 member states. Now, so the remaining member states. Now, this is the highest political authority of the European Union, and they provided the principal steer for the negotiations. And any really tricky issues are going to be whipped up to the European Council level. Then we have the Council of the European Union, and in the context of the Brexit negotiations, they'll be meeting in the formation of the General Affairs Council. And again, this is a body for the representation of national interests for the EU 27 member states. However, they meet at a ministerial level. And then finally, we have the European Parliament. Now, actually, the European Parliament formally has a very limited role. However, under the leadership of Guy Verhofstadt, we've seen that already the European Parliament has been really outspoken and will be flexing its muscles, particularly pushing forward for the rights of its citizens throughout the Brexit negotiations. So these are the actors that we need to keep an eye on over the coming months and the coming years. Now, the negotiations, we know, are going to take place in these 4-week cycles, so a week of negotiations and 3 weeks for the exchanging of information and preparatory work. And they will be conducted in light of the European Council guidelines, in line with the negotiating directives which were prepared by the European Commission, and with due regard to the resolution which came from the European Parliament. Now, the reason I just whizzed through that was really to hammer home to you here is that the European Union, the institutions of the EU, and indeed the EU 27 member states have been extraordinarily unified when it's come to the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. So right from the immediately following the EU referendum, there has been unwavering consistency in the European Union's red lines and articulation of how they see the process unfolding. And this is something that we need to be very aware of, because there was some, I think, hope in the UK that perhaps it would be possible to pick off member states one by one, and we'd see cracks emerging between institutions and between the member states. However, up to now, we have not seen evidence of that. As I say, really extraordinarily unified with respect to Brexit. Also, what we need to keep clear in our minds is that Brexit is not the only thing on the EU agenda, and they have been very clear in articulating this. They have a very busy policy agenda, and they want to crack on with Brexit as one of the range of different issues that they are dealing with. Now, what I want to do is just zoom down into one of the policy texts that I mentioned earlier on. This is the European Council guidelines on the Brexit negotiations, and they were agreed on the 29th of April 2017. Now, if you're wanting to get a better understanding of the EU's approach to the negotiations, then I really recommend that you Google this text and have a look at this text. It's very, very accessible. It's not dreadfully long. I think it's 8 pages or so. And it gives you a very neat and tidy overview of both the substance of negotiations, so the issues that are going to be discussed, and also the shape of the negotiations themselves. As I say, I do recommend you have a look at this. So we know that the negotiations are going to take place through a phased approach. And phase 1 is going to be focused on ensuring an orderly withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. And as part of this, there will be focused on 3 different issues. And my apologies, one of my bullet points has disappeared here. The first of the 3 issues, it concerns citizens' rights. So this is the rights of EU 27 nationals in the UK and UK nationals in the remainder of the European Union. The second one is the financial settlement. So this is the amount of the money that the UK will be required to pay in order to meet the obligations that it's already committed to as a member of the European Union. And then finally is the issue of the border between the UK and the European Union. So the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Now, the European Union has been very clear that these 3 issues are going to be at the front and centre of the negotiations to start with, and they will not be moving on to phase 2 until there has been sufficient progress on these 3 issues. However, when the European Council, so this is the heads of state and government, when they have deemed that there has been sufficient progress, then negotiations can open up to considering also the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. So this is a phased approach that we're going to see. Now what I want to do is turn to those couple of issues that I think we haven't really in the UK been sensitive enough to, and I really hope we can get thinking about this now. The first concerns that future relationship between the UK and the European Union. We really need to make sure that we're prepared for the public and political discussions that will be taking place around this. So let's begin with the Prime Minister's Article 50 letter, so that launched the Article 50 process. It was delivered by Tim Barrow to Donald Tusk on Wednesday, the 29th of March, a really historic day, and I can remember exactly where I was the moment that this photo was taken, as I'm sure many of you can remember as well. Now, in this letter, which again is worth a read if you haven't had a look at it, it was very conciliatory in tone. And the Prime Minister called for a future deep and special partnership between the UK and the European Union. Indeed, in the letter, I think deep and special partnership was mentioned 6 or 7 times in the letter. Now, this is to be underpinned, she hopes, by a comprehensive trade agreement, but not any comprehensive trade agreement, but one of greater scope and ambition than any such agreement before. Now, what we really have to be alert to is the nature of these free trade agreements. And I don't think yet that we're fully literate about what we mean and what's part of a free trade agreement. Now, the European Union has been very clear that as part of any free trade agreement, they will secure against unfair competitive advantage. So they will secure against dumping on a number of grounds. So with respect to employment and social rights, environmental protection, fiscal and tax issues, and also regulatory measures. Now, in part, the European Union, I think, has been responding to the rather thinly veiled threats we've had both from the Prime Minister and from the Chancellor of the Exchequer that if the UK isn't able to get the type of access it wants to the single market, then it will be in the position to change its economic model. So to become a more competitive nation, so a move towards deregulation and reducing corporation tax. And the European Union has been very alert to this. So if you go to all the official Article 50 texts that have come from the European Council, the European Commission and the European Parliament, they have said, as part of a free trade agreement, we will make sure that built in within that is assurances against this unfair competitive advantage. Now, what we have to be prepared for in the UK is the discussions around that. I'm really curious about how these discussions will play out, because there are certain of us who, or certain people, I would say, who advocated very strongly for leave to be freed from the shackles of Brussels. So how will they respond to the potential of having these social employment, environmental protections built into a future trade agreement? So we need to be alert to this and be prepared for the discussions that are going to take place. Then, something else that, again, we need to be really mindful of is that the European Union isn't static. It's evolving and it is dynamic, and particularly at the moment. Now, the referendum in the UK served to, I think it was a catalyst more than anything else. Many people will say it really inspired the launch of a discussion about the future direction of travel of the European Union. So a real thinking about what is the future of the integration process for the remaining EU 27, with the UK outside the European bloc. So on the 1st of March 2017, whilst we were all celebrating St. David's Day, the European Commission were launching a white paper on the future of Europe to begin this years-long process about really thinking about the direction of travel of the European Union. Now, one of the more immediate milestones after the launch of this paper came at the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Treaties of Rome. And the Treaties of Rome established the early shoots for what became the European Union that we know today. And at that summit, there was a commitment from the EU 27 heads of state to moving towards a multi-speed EU. So there would be a common direction of travel across the EU 27 member states, but certain member states would move more swiftly than others. In addition to these kind of more broad, overarching discussions about the nature of European integration, the EU has also been digging down into different policy areas. So has launched a number of different reflection pieces. So the first one was around social Europe. So how are these EU member states going to work with each other or not around these social issues? So what is the direction of travel? And the most recent one is around European defence. So what ought the European Union to be doing on defence? What is their direction of travel? So as well as these broad overarching questions, they're looking down, digging down into different sectors. And this reflection process will last a number of years and is due to come to some kind of conclusion in 2019. Now, it's really important in the UK that we are sensitive to the changing nature of the European Union, because the relationship that we establish is not with the EU of today, it's with the EU of 5, 10, 15 years' time. Now, this has consequences, more immediate consequences for the shape of that free trade agreement. So the outcome of discussions around, say, social Europe, that will matter for what gets included as part of that free trade agreement. But also we need to be alert to and very aware of what our nearest neighbours are doing on other issues that perhaps aren't built in to any formal agreement between the UK and the European Union. So we need to be aware of what the European Union is doing around energy policy and the environment and around defence. So this is a second of those two issues. So the first around the free trade agreement and being really prepared for the types of discussions that are going to come as part of that. And the second one is really being sensitive to the direction of travel of the European Union and how that will have more immediate implications for the negotiations, but also for our future relationship with our neighbour over the coming years, indeed the coming decades. So I'll leave you with a number of, I hope, useful resources, and if you would like these slides, then please get in touch with me and I will very happily forward them on to you. But one I do want to highlight is the European Commission's own website on the Article 50 process. Now, the European Union has been very clear that they are blasting this with transparency, in part because the European Union itself, it's very leaky. So actually, it's much easier if the European Commission can take control of this, and there'll be a measured sharing of the documents. So as you're doing your research in a professional and personal capacity around the Brexit negotiations and as well the future relationship between the UK and the European Union, I think this will be a really useful port of call to get some more information. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you.